What if the calm farmlands of Indiana suddenly became the front line in America's most controversial immigration crackdown? That is exactly what has unfolded. In the opening weeks of 2025, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, backed by state authorities and endorsed by President Donald Trump's administration, carried out a massive sweep across the state. The results stunned both supporters and critics. More than 1,400 undocumented immigrants were arrested or deported in a single operation, an increase of nearly 80% compared to the previous year. For many residents, the images were jarring. Police vans lined up outside quiet neighborhoods. Officers knocked on doors in small towns where people had long assumed that such enforcement belonged to the border states of Texas or Arizona. The message from Washington was unmistakable. No state is beyond reach, and federal law must be applied evenly across the nation. Indiana, often associated with cornfields and family values, has now become the proving ground for a new model of interior immigration enforcement. The scale of the arrests has generated both relief and unease. Supporters argue that the operation dismantled hidden networks tied to criminal activities. Cases involving drug trafficking, identity fraud, and even violent assault were cited among those detained. To parents worried about safety in schools and shopkeepers fearing theft, this was a promise fulfilled law enforcement acting decisively to secure their communities. Yet the sweep also sparked urgent questions. How far should state agencies go in partnering with federal immigration authorities? Governor Mike Braun announced that Indiana's agencies would now formally assist in detaining undocumented immigrants, effectively binding state law enforcement into the federal framework. Critics immediately warned of blurred lines. Could this discourage immigrant families, some with mixed legal status, from reporting crimes or cooperating with police? The operation also resonates far beyond Indiana. Analysts at Reuters and BBC have noted that the Midwest, traditionally viewed as insulated from border politics, is becoming the new testing ground for immigration enforcement strategy. Just as NATO adapts to Russian drone incursions in Eastern Europe, the US homeland is adapting to what officials call internal vulnerabilities. The concept is simple. Security threats do not respect geography. Whether drones over Poland or undocumented migration in Indiana, institutions must respond. Western security experts, including those cited in Defense News, emphasize that enforcement operations of this size serve as deterrents. Much like NATO patrols are meant to signal strength to Moscow, or Tehran's sweeping arrests are designed to send a message both to undocumented residents already in the country and to those considering crossing the border illegally. According to former DHS officials, a figure like 1,400 arrests in weeks is statistically significant. It not only strains federal detention capacity, but also demonstrates to allies and adversaries that the Trump administration intends to use full-spectrum enforcement across all states. However, just as large-scale NATO exercises can risk provoking unintended escalations, mass arrests risk undermining trust at the local level. Civil rights organizations warn that indiscriminate enforcement could deepen divisions and fuel narratives of overreach. The Guardian reported in early 2025 that such heavy-handed tactics may push immigrant communities further underground, eroding cooperation with law enforcement and potentially making neighborhoods less safe in the long run. In the broader strategic context, this Midwest crackdown mirrors a global trend, states asserting control within their own borders amid geopolitical instability abroad. While NATO debates troop deployments near Ukraine and Israel, weighs preemptive actions against Iran, the US homeland projects a similar philosophy strength through deterrence, even in America's heartland. So the central question remains, can Indiana's unprecedented arrests serve as a model for balancing law, order, and community trust? Or do they risk becoming the beginning of a deeper social divide? And more importantly, will this new frontier of enforcement ultimately make America safer or simply more fractured? The next stage in Indiana's transformation came with the rapid expansion of the federal program known as 287G. Under this arrangement, local police officers are trained and authorized to enforce federal immigration law, turning ordinary county jails into direct pipelines for immigration and customs enforcement. In practical terms, this meant that every individual booked into a local jail in Indiana now had their immigration status checked. If they lacked legal status, ICE was immediately notified and custody would transfer seamlessly once local charges were resolved. The Trump administration hailed this as closing a dangerous loophole. Before undocumented individuals arrested for crimes, sometimes even felonies, were often released before ICE could intervene. Now, as one sheriff put it, there's no escape route. Supporters say the system increases deterrence. If you commit a crime, while undocumented, you will be identified, detained, and deported without delay. But beneath the efficiency lies a sharp debate. Civil rights groups have argued that 287G risks blurring the line between local policing and federal authority. According to reporting from The Guardian and DW in early 2025, immigrant families may now hesitate to report crimes, fearing that any contact with law enforcement could expose them to deportation. This reluctance, they warn, might embolden gangs or traffickers who can exploit a community's fear of the police. Indiana's law enforcement leaders counter that the risks are outweighed by the benefits. They point to cases in which previously arrested individuals released under older procedures later committed violent crimes. With 287G, they argue the system is finally capable of intervening before tragedies occur. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly draw a parallel here with NATO's intelligence sharing mechanisms. By closing gaps between local and international systems, the alliance prevents adversaries from slipping through unnoticed. The same principle, they note, is being applied domestically in Indiana. The operational impact is striking. In counties piloting the program, dozens of immigration violators are flagged weekly. Statewide projections estimate that hundreds more will face federal custody by the year's end. For law enforcement officers who long felt their hands were tied, this cooperation represents a new level of capability. It is not only about catching criminals, but about restoring a sense of law and order. Still, the risks of overreach remain real. DW highlighted community concerns that the same tools used to capture drug traffickers might also ensnare farm workers or long-term residents who pose no threat. This dynamic mirrors international dilemmas just as counterterrorism strikes risk collateral damage. Aggressive immigration enforcement risks sweeping up the innocent alongside the guilty. From a broader security perspective, the Indiana rollout of 287G demonstrates how federal policy can reshape entire regions. The Midwest, once seen as politically removed from border concerns, is now central to the debate, and the Trump administration appears determined to use this state as a model for nationwide expansion. Experts at Reuters note that if successful, this coordination between state and federal agencies could soon spread to Ohio, Michigan, and beyond. The strategic framing is clear. The same way NATO emphasizes readiness across all fronts, the U.S. homeland is emphasizing uniform enforcement across all states. No region is a safe haven. This approach reflects a larger doctrine of deterrence at both domestic and international levels. But here lies the crucial question: will this seamless cooperation strengthen trust in law enforcement, or will it fracture the delicate balance between safety and civil rights? And as Indiana becomes a laboratory for this experiment, what lessons, positive or negative, will the rest of America inherit? The story of Indiana's crackdown took on an even sharper edge when Camp Atterbury, a former military installation south of Indianapolis, was repurposed into a detention hub for immigration enforcement. Once home to U.S. Army training exercises, it now holds rows of cots processing desks and federal officers working late into the night. With a capacity exceeding 1,000 detainees at a time, this facility provides ICE with a permanent foothold in the Midwest. Supporters frame this transformation as an essential step toward efficiency. Before Atterbury's conversion, detainees often had to be transported hundreds of miles to Illinois or Kentucky, straining resources and creating dangerous logistical delays. Now cases can be processed, reviewed, and transferred directly from Indiana soil. To those backing President Trump's policy, the message is unmistakable. Indiana is no longer a weak link, but a model of logistical strength. Yet the optics remain controversial. Civil rights advocates and human rights organizations have warned that placing immigration detainees in a former military base risks militarizing a civil issue. Al Jazeera reported in early 2025 that families viewed the facility's barbed wire fences and guard towers as a symbol of hostility, not justice. The psychological impact of seeing military infrastructure deployed against immigrant populations has fueled heated debates in city halls and state houses. On the other side, Indiana's law enforcement leaders argue that such concerns miss the point. They emphasize that Atterbury is not a battlefield, but a controlled environment where processing is faster, safer, and more transparent. Supporters describe the site not as symbolic aggression, but as symbolic order, a demonstration that the state has both the infrastructure and the will to enforce federal law without compromise. From a strategic lens, the Atterbury development mirrors global trends where military assets are adapted for hybrid missions. Just as NATO forces in Poland have converted air bases into drone monitoring hubs, Indiana has reconfigured military grounds into enforcement centers. Analysts at Defense News note that such repurposing reflects a 21st century reality. The boundaries between civil and security operations are increasingly blurred both at home and abroad. The timing also resonates with international crises. In the same months that Camp Atterbury opened, NATO reported record numbers of Russian drones entering European airspace, and Israel continued preemptive strikes against Iranian weapons convoys. The logic is consistent infrastructure once reserved for warfighting now supports homeland security missions. This parallel strengthens Washington's argument that enforcement at home and deterrence abroad are parts of the same strategic doctrine. Still, questions linger about the human cost. Critics warn that fencing off hundreds of people in a militarized facility risks deepening social divisions. Could this approach create a perception that immigrant communities are enemies rather than residents? The Guardian noted that stigmatization of vulnerable groups historically undermines long-term integration and stability. But law and order advocates counter with a hard truth, ignoring enforcement risks repeating tragedies. They point to cases where previously detained individuals later committed serious crimes when released prematurely. For them, Atterbury is not about symbolism, it is about preventing avoidable harm. Indiana's new detention hub has therefore become a flashpoint in the national debate. It encapsulates the tension between efficiency and perception, deterrence and division. Much like NATO's use of forward bases in Eastern Europe sparks arguments over escalation versus protection, Camp Atterbury sparks debate over whether America's heartland is safeguarding its people or militarizing its neighborhoods. So the dilemma crystallizes: does Atterbury represent necessary modernization, or does it mark a dangerous step toward militarizing civil enforcement? And if Indiana becomes the blueprint, will other states embrace the model or reject it as a bridge too far? The debate over Indiana's enforcement efforts reached a new intensity when a single case put human tragedy at the center of the argument. In November 2024, Wilson Chavez, a 27-year-old undocumented immigrant from Honduras, was arrested after allegedly stabbing and killing a man during an altercation at a Candlewood Suites hotel in Indianapolis. For local families, the shock was immediate. A crime scene at a hotel where parents often booked weekend getaways now became a symbol of fragility in community safety. For immigration and customs enforcement, the Chavez case became a rallying point. Officials argued that if immigration databases had flagged him earlier during a previous arrest for driving without a license, the fatal incident might have been prevented. Supporters of President Trump's expanded 287G partnership seized on the tragedy, saying it proved the need for seamless cooperation between state jails and federal enforcement. In their view, enforcement isn't abstract. It is the line between safety and avoidable loss of life. Yet critics warned of dangerous generalizations. Civil rights organizations cautioned against treating every undocumented immigrant as a potential criminal. They pointed out that the vast majority of undocumented residents in Indiana had no history of violence, often working in farms, factories, or service industries. According to The Guardian, blanket enforcement risks stigmatizing entire communities, deepening mistrust, and making it harder for police to gather tips that prevent crime in the first place. The public debate mirrored broader global dynamics. NATO officials in Brussels, commenting on unrelated European security challenges in early 2025, noted that deterrence is always a balance strong enough to prevent attacks, but careful enough not to alienate allies or civilians. Indiana's challenge, though, domestic, follows a similar pattern. Too little enforcement and criminals slip through. Too much and communities fracture. Western security analysts cited by BBC emphasized that the Chavez case underlines a principle known in counterterrorism circles as the prevention paradox. Success is invisible crimes that never happen, because threats are intercepted early rarely make headlines. But failure is glaring, as in Indianapolis, where one preventable act of violence now defines the public debate. Indiana's leaders are using the case to justify new infrastructure like Camp Atterbury, arguing that every jurisdiction must have the tools to detain individuals before they reoffend. Meanwhile, human rights advocates stress that a single case should not dictate policy for thousands. Al Jazeera's coverage underscored the psychological weight immigrant families now fear that one person's crime will be used to paint them all as threats. This debate also touches America's global image. At a time when the US is pressuring allies to uphold international law, whether in Ukraine, where Russia continues drone strikes, or in the Middle East, where Israel and Iran trade blows, the treatment of vulnerable populations at home is scrutinized abroad. European analysts interviewed by DW noted that how America enforces its laws domestically affects its credibility when calling on NATO partners to respect human rights overseas. The Chavez case thus became more than a local tragedy. It became a litmus test for policy. Should Indiana double down on deterrence, or should it build safeguards to prevent overreach? Each path carries consequences. And as federal vans continue to roll through Indiana highways, one haunting question remains: how many future tragedies will enforcement prevent, and how many fractures will it create within America's own communities? Beyond the headlines of raids, detention centers, and individual tragedies, the broader significance of Indiana's crackdown lies in its potential as a national model. The Midwest, long seen as politically calm and geographically removed from border struggles, has now become the staging ground for what officials describe as full-spectrum enforcement. If such large-scale actions can succeed in Indiana, they could be replicated across Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and beyond. Supporters within the Trump administration frame this as proof of principle: law is only credible if it is enforced everywhere. Just as NATO insists on defending every inch of Allied territory, the White House insists that no state is exempt from federal immigration law. For rural towns in Indiana, this message resonates. Parents want safe schools, shopkeepers want theft reduced, and communities demand stability. To many, the crackdown is overdue. Yet the national implications are profound. Reuters analysts noted in January 2025 that Indiana's operation represents a shift in how immigration enforcement is viewed, not as a border challenge, but as a nationwide responsibility. Much as NATO adapted to Russian drone incursions by strengthening defenses far from traditional hotspots, America is adapting by extending enforcement into the heartland. The strategic doctrine is unmistakable deterrence through ubiquity. But critics caution against adopting Indiana's model wholesale. DW's European coverage of the debate highlights a parallel with EU migration policies. Aggressive enforcement may appear effective in the short term, but risks fueling mistrust and division in the long run. In Germany, for instance, critics of harsh measures argue that integration, not militarization, provides more sustainable stability. The same arguments are surfacing in Indiana town halls. Meanwhile, the US global posture cannot be ignored. At the very moment Indiana was ramping up its enforcement, NATO confirmed new Russian airspace violations over Estonia, while the Pentagon deployed additional assets to the South China Sea amid rising US-China tensions. Analysts at Defense News draw a compelling connection: domestic enforcement. They argue projects an image of internal discipline that strengthens America's credibility abroad. Just as deterrence against Moscow or Beijing requires unity, so too does enforcing federal law within US borders. Numbers add weight to this perspective. More than 1,400 arrests in just weeks, hundreds flagged through 287 jail programs, and a detention hub capable of holding over 1,000 individuals. These are not symbolic gestures. They represent a systemic shift in capacity. Jane's Defense Weekly described this as scaling interior enforcement to military proportions, a phrase that captures both the ambition and the controversy. But the trade-offs remain stark. Civil rights groups warn that the same mechanisms designed to catch dangerous criminals can just as easily ensnare long-term residents with no record of violence. Critics argue that such overreach risks fueling distrust in law enforcement, undermining the very security the program claims to protect. This echoes concerns voiced by The Guardian, which cautioned that sweeping policies risk collapsing the distinction between criminals and communities. Strategically, Indiana has become a test case not only for immigration policy, but for America's broader doctrine of deterrence. The question is whether this deterrence builds resilience or erodes cohesion. Allies abroad are watching closely. If the United States struggles to balance enforcement and trust at home, can it credibly demand that NATO partners do the same abroad? The stakes are no longer confined to Indiana. They stretch into the national debate on identity governance and America's role in a turbulent world. Which path will prevail: a model of security that unites the nation, or a precedent that deepens its divides? Indiana's crackdown culminates in a lesson that extends far beyond the Midwest. With over 1,400 arrests, seamless 287 enforcement, and the conversion of Camp Atterbury into a detention hub, the state has become the symbol of a national turning point. It embodies four central pillars of America's new enforcement doctrine: public safety, law and order, community trust, and national security. Supporters argue that these pillars reinforce each other. By removing dangerous offenders before they can re-offend, the system directly protects schools, businesses, and families. By enforcing immigration law consistently, Indiana demonstrates that rules apply equally in every state, not only at the border. By assuring parents and shopkeepers that crimes will not be ignored, officials seek to strengthen community trust. And by securing the homeland against uncontrolled migration, leaders argue that national security itself is bolstered. But as with every strategy built on deterrence, the pillars stand on contested ground. Critics emphasize that heavy-handed enforcement risks eroding the very trust it seeks to build. If families fear police more than criminals, neighborhoods may withdraw into silence, creating blind spots where illicit networks can thrive. The Guardian, reflecting on Indiana's operation, described it as a paradox of enforcement. Stronger rules may simultaneously strengthen order and fracture cohesion. The global context makes this paradox even sharper, as NATO scrambles fighters in response to Russian airspace violations, and Israel intensifies strikes against Iranian weapons. Deposed, the US is projecting a consistent doctrine deterrence through visibility. Indiana's sweeps are to immigration what NATO patrols are to deterrence in Eastern Europe, symbolic acts with strategic weight. Defense news analysts argue that both domestically and internationally, the Trump administration is betting that visible enforcement discourages adversaries and reassures allies. Numbers reinforce the point. An 80% increase in arrests over the previous year, detention capacity for more than 1,000 individuals, and statewide projections of hundreds more detainees by year's end. These are figures that underscore resolve. Western experts compare these statistics to NATO's troop surges in Poland and the Baltics, measurable evidence that policy is not merely rhetorical but operational. Yet even as supporters celebrate, the divisions are impossible to ignore. DW reports that Indiana town halls are split between residents praising new safety measures and immigrant families fearing stigmatization. Al Jazeera highlights the psychological toll of militarized detention centers, while Reuters frames Indiana as the new front line in America's immigration debate. The tension is undeniable. America is both safer and more divided, both resolute and uncertain. The seasoned perspective of a military analyst is clear. This is not only about immigration, it is about strategy. The US is applying principles of deterrence, integration of forces, and visible readiness at home in the same way it does abroad. Indiana's transformation is therefore more than local. It is emblematic of how nations project strength, manage risk, and negotiate the delicate balance between security and liberty. But as history shows, deterrence can only endure if it retains legitimacy. NATO succeeds when its members trust the alliance. Domestic enforcement succeeds when communities trust their institutions. Indiana has drawn a line in the sand. The pressing question is whether America will stand taller because of it or more divided. So what comes next? Will Indiana's model spread nationwide as the blueprint for law and order, or will it be remembered as the moment America began to fracture from within? And for viewers watching this unfold, do you believe the balance between safety and freedom has been struck, or is the nation still searching? Subscribe, join the debate, and help shape the conversation. Indiana has emerged as an unlikely front line in America's immigration debate. Backed by President Donald Trump's administration, federal and state authorities arrested more than 1,400 undocumented immigrants in a sweeping crackdown, an 80% increase over the previous year. The expansion of the 287G program gave local jails direct authority to enforce federal immigration law, closing loopholes but raising civil rights concerns. The conversion of Camp Atterbury into a detention hub highlighted the scale of the operation, praised by supporters as efficient but criticized by human rights groups as militarized. The case of Wilson Chavez, accused of a fatal stabbing in Indianapolis, became a flashpoint, fueling arguments for tougher enforcement while intensifying community fears of stigmatization. Strategically, Indiana has become a national test case embodying 4 pillars: public safety, law and order, community trust, and national security. The state's crackdown mirrors global trends in deterrence, from NATO's Eastern European defenses to US actions in the Middle East and Asia. The central question remains unresolved. Does Indiana's model represent the future of American security or the start of deeper national division? That debate will shape the country's path for years to come.